Many millions of years ago, a group of beings on a distant planet grew tired of arguing about the meaning of life. So they decided to do something about it. They built the greatest computer known to the universe, which was the size of a small city, capable of computing the greatest answer of all time. 2 programs turned on the computer for the first time, and it demanded to know what function they wanted it to perform. And so they told it that they want the answer to life, the universe, and everything. The computer said that that'll be tricky, but it is possible. It would need some time to think about it, though. In fact, the computer said that this was so tricky, it was going to require 7.5 million years to figure it out. So, 7.5 million years later, the descendants of these people gathered on what they called the Great and Hopeful Enlightening Day, the day of the answer. It was an exciting day. The entire planet, the entire city was there to hear this answer. And the suspense was just so thick. I'm sure as you're thinking about that, you can kind of feel that building up. You want to know the answer to life, the universe, and everything. But when the computer announced the answer, it was 42. The crowd was flabbergasted. But the computer reassured them that it had checked the answer very thoroughly. And it added, I think the problem, to be quite honest with you, is that you've never actually known what the question is. Now, some of you may know that this is a fictional story. It's from a cult classic science fiction comedy novel from Douglas Adams called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And while this is obviously a fictional search for wisdom, I would argue that it very well illustrates how we often approach gaining wisdom. We seek out wisdom. We look for answers to life's biggest questions. And we start out looking for these answers, and we think we're doing okay. We think we're gaining an edge on the world or even on our neighbor. We think we know more, we're in the right. Everyone else is just catching up. But we often find that we end up straying along the way. Sometimes we find out that we had it wrong from the start. Maybe we didn't even know what the question was. Upon being visited in a dream by God, King Solomon is given the chance to ask God for whatever he wants. And God says it will be granted to you. And of all the things that Solomon could have asked for, he asked for a discerning heart. He's asking God for wisdom. This is a good and righteous thing in God's eyes, which we see in the text of 1 Kings 3. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, or have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Because Solomon did not ask for those selfish things, God was pleased to grant him not only wisdom, but wealth and honor so that he could be a king without equal, and long life on top of it, so that he could lead God's people well into the future. But, and this is not our Valentine's weekend message, Solomon goes on to develop a love for the ladies, and he began to follow his own heart. He disobeys God. He marries women from neighboring pagan nations that God specifically warned the Israelites to stay away from. And that becomes his downfall. His wives entice him into worshiping other gods and forgetting his obedience to the one true God. The wisdom Solomon has been granted did not keep him from straying, and it did not keep him faithful to God. 1 Kings 11 goes on to tell us how God deals with that. The one whom he had previously been happy to grant these gifts of wisdom, honor, and life to, well, he has to deal with that later. And it says that the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." It seems that wisdom can be a fickle thing to chase. Not only can it be fleeting or difficult to discern or grasp onto, it does not seem to prevent us from making bad choices. I can't tell you this for sure, but I would not be surprised if Solomon actually felt comfortable chasing his own desire because he felt the wisdom that he had been granted would lead him down all of the right paths. We might be tempted to say, even then, that wisdom is not what we should be seeking. But yet, wisdom was a gift that God was happy to give to Solomon. He was so pleased that Solomon sought wisdom that God also gave him those other things that he didn't even ask for. So wisdom cannot be inherently bad. The first passage that came to my mind regarding wisdom comes to us from the Epistle of James. In fact, this passage encourages us to do the very same thing that Solomon did, minus the womanizing, of course. But it also calls out a very specific stipulation, one that was actually present for Solomon as well. Let's read from the first chapter of James. "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created." Wisdom is indeed a gift from God. And if God gives a gift, then it is good and it is perfect. However, wisdom, and I would argue most or all of God's gifts, are not set it and forget it kind of gifts. They require something to nurture them, cause them to be fruitful. In other words, we should not just ask God for wisdom, assume he has granted it to us because we asked, and then assume everything that we do or say from that point will be born of godly wisdom. That is how we get ourselves on wrong paths. Instead, James tells us that when we ask, we must believe and not doubt. James is telling us that we must have faith. If we go back to our first passage with Solomon, God gives Solomon a command in the middle of bestowing those gifts on him. Solomon must walk in obedience and keep God's commands. Solomon must keep his faithfulness. When Solomon does not keep his faithfulness, when he seeks refuge in all of his many wives and their gods, that becomes the point when all of the wisdom in the world doesn't help him. Without faith, the wisdom means nothing. Wisdom and faith sometimes seem like two opposite things. We think of wisdom as the pursuit of knowledge and faith as the pursuit of belief. But I think we glean from Scripture that's not the case. Instead, it seems like wisdom, like so many of God's gifts, is something that grows out of faith. When Jesus explains the parable of the sower to his disciples, he talks about how seeds can still start to grow in conditions that are not ideal. The rocky ground does not allow the seed to take root, and so the plant doesn't last. A plant can grow in thorns and perhaps lasts longer than on the rocks, but eventually the thorns will choke out the plant and kill it. But the good soil produces a crop yielding 100 or 60 or 30 times what was sown. When we see Jesus is talking about hearing the word, but also being able to understand it and apply it, I think we can reasonably say that this is the heart of wisdom. Hearing that word, though, requires good and fertile soil to help it grow. That is faith. When someone receives the word, even if they respond well to it at first, if their faith does not give that word room to grow, it will wither. When a person receives that word with the faith that they need to understand and discern what they are hearing, that is what gives that word what it needs to grow into abundance. God granted Solomon wisdom, but when that was rooted in faith, Solomon's gifts grew to abundance. He warned Solomon that he needed that faith to ensure that those gifts didn't wither. Solomon lost his faith, and thus Solomon lost his gifts. James tells us that God does grant wisdom, and that wisdom is a good and perfect gift because it comes from God. But we must ask in faith, because that's how wisdom grows. Jesus tells us that hearing the word may cause a plant to spring up, even on rocky or thorny ground. But unless it's nurtured in faith, that understanding will never grow into abundance. When we take God's gifts and when we run with them on our own, that's when we get off track. When we ask our computers for the wisdom to know the answer to life, the universe, and everything, that's when we get answers like 42. Wisdom doesn't take us far with answers like that. When we're searching for wisdom, when we're dealing with any of God's many gifts, faith is the factor that makes that gift fruitful. Faith is the factor that makes us first fruits, as James puts it. Our gifts from God must remain planted in faith, because in faith, all of God's good and perfect gifts will grow to abundance. And all of God's people said,